In 1969, two men squeezed through a gap in a limestone cave in rural South Australia, barely wide enough for a human body, and shone a torch into the darkness on the other side. What the light landed on stopped them cold, an entire chamber floor covered in bones. Not a handful of scattered fossils, but skulls, jaws, and skeletons stacked in their thousands, undisturbed for hundreds of thousands of years. One scientist would later compare the moment to opening Tutankhamun's tomb. What they had actually found was something stranger, a natural trap that had been silently swallowing animals for longer than modern humans have existed on any continent, and preserving the evidence perfectly the entire time. This is Naracoorte Caves, a quiet, unremarkable-looking cave system beneath a small farming town, now recognised as one of the richest fossil deposits on Earth. What was pulled out of that chamber didn't just add a few new species to the record. It rewrote what scientists thought they knew about Australia's lost giants, how they lived, and after decades of argument, how they actually died. If you're new here, welcome to Hidden Origins. This channel exists to unearth Australia's hidden history, its ancient sacred sites, its buried geology, and the mysteries still sitting quietly beneath this continent's landscapes. If you want to keep exploring the unknown side of Australia with us, subscribe now, because this is one of the strangest stories we've covered yet. To understand what makes Naracoorte so extraordinary, you have to understand what it actually is underneath the surface. The caves sit in a region of South Australia known as the Limestone Coast, where the ground itself is built from an ancient seabed, compressed over millions of years into soft, porous rock. Rainwater, slightly acidic from the air and soil it passes through, slowly dissolves that limestone from within, hollowing out cavities, tunnels, and chambers deep underground. Over time, some of those chambers reach close enough to the surface that the ceiling collapses, or a narrow sinkhole opens straight down into the darkness. That is the mechanism that made Naracoorte famous, but not for the reason most people expect. These sinkholes did not just let water in. They acted as pitfall traps. An animal grazing at night, unaware of the ground beneath it, could step onto a thin crust of soil and vegetation and fall straight through into a cave far below, with no way back up. Some chambers at Naracoorte functioned this way continuously for more than 300,000 years, one animal at a time, generation after generation, species after species. Bones accumulated on the chamber floor while wind and rain slowly washed sediment in through the same opening, burying each layer beneath the next, almost like the pages of a book. The result is a fossil deposit that isn't just large. It's sequential, a layered, datable timeline of exactly which animals were alive in this part of Australia at almost any point across 500,000 years, right up until many of them vanished for good. Nowhere else on the continent has preserved that timeline so completely or so undisturbed until two cavers found the gap that led into it. Long before any scientists climbed down into these chambers, this landscape was already known, named, and cared for. The limestone coast around Naracoorte sits across the traditional lands of the Potterawitch, Mintank, and Bunganditch peoples, whose connection to this country stretches back tens of thousands of years, through the exact stretch of time these caves were quietly filling with bone. Naracoorte's own name is widely believed to derive from an Aboriginal word describing a place of running water, a description that still holds true in a region shaped almost entirely by the movement of water through limestone. Underground spaces like these caves held real cultural and spiritual significance for traditional owners. Understood as part of a living landscape tied to creation stories and ancestral beings passed down through oral tradition, long before geology or paleontology existed as ideas. That knowledge was carried differently than a scientific paper is carried. It moved through story, through song, through the careful teaching of one generation to the next, encoding an understanding of this land's depth, its history, and its significance that had nothing to do with excavation tools or radiocarbon dates. It is a sobering thought that the giant extinct animal scientists would later pull from these chambers were not simply prehistoric abstractions to the deep human history of this region. Aboriginal people were already present on this continent, while many of these species were still alive, sharing the same landscape, the same waterholes, and quite possibly the same caves that would later become their grave and, tens of thousands of years after that, a scientific sensation. Elsewhere in Australia, oral traditions describe giant creatures and transformed landscapes in ways that some researchers believe may encode genuine folk memory of megafauna and the environmental changes that followed their disappearance, passed down with a continuity almost impossible to fully grasp from outside it. Modern excavation at Naracoorte has only been possible because of ongoing recognition of this deeper history, and any serious account of what these caves contain has to start with the fact that they were never empty, undiscovered wilderness. They were and remain part of a living cultural landscape that long predates the first torch beam that hit that chamber floor in 1969. The record inside these caves reads like a roll call of a lost continent. Cave explorer Grant Gartrell and paleontologist Rod Wells of Flinders University were the two men who broke through into Victoria Fossil Cave that day in 1969, and what they mapped out over the following years became one of the most significant fossil sites in the Southern Hemisphere. Among the skeletons pulled from the sediment was Thylacoleo carnifex, the marsupial lion, a leopard-sized predator with the strongest bite force relative to body size of any mammal known to science, found here in some of the most complete skeletons ever recovered. Beside it lay Procoptodon goliah, a giant short-faced kangaroo standing up to 2 meters tall, built more like a heavyweight boxer than anything hopping through Australia today. Deeper in the sediment, researchers uncovered Wonambi naracoortensis, a giant constricting snake stretching several meters long, named directly after the site itself. Alongside them were the bones of Zygomaturus, a heavy-set, hippo-sized herbivore, and Palaeontology, an odd. Long-clawed marsupial, sometimes nicknamed the marsupial tapir. Ordinary Tasmanian devils and thylacines, the so-called Tasmanian tigers, turned up in the same layers, animals that once ranged across the mainland long before either species vanished from it. By the 1990s, researchers had documented more than 90 vertebrate species from the site, around a quarter of them now extinct, drawn from a fossil sequence estimated to span at least 350,000 years, with some tourism material citing figures closer to 500,000. In 1994, UNESCO listed Naracoorte Caves as a World Heritage Site, one of only a small number in Australia recognised specifically for what lies beneath the ground, rather than what stands on top of it. A fresh wave of excavation between 2012 and 2015 opened up new sections of the fossil chamber entirely, adding 3 distinct occupational phases to the record, and giving researchers a far more precise, layer-by-layer timeline than anything available in the 1970s. And the astonishing part is scale, after more than 5 decades of digging. Researchers estimate that only a small fraction of the fossil-bearing sediment at Naracoorte has ever been excavated. Everything catalogued so far, every marsupial lion skeleton and every giant kangaroo skull, may be a preview of a much larger record still buried in the dark, waiting for the next team willing to squeeze through the next narrow gap in the rock. If you're expecting the mystery to end with a simple answer, keep watching, because what killed off Australia's giants sparked one of the longest-running arguments in Australian science, and the real answer only started coming together in the last few years. Make sure you're subscribed to Hidden Origins before we get there. For more than a century, one question hung over every fossil pulled from Naracoorte and sites like it across the country. What actually killed Australia's megafauna? 2 competing explanations dominated the debate, and each had serious scientists behind it. One camp argued for climate change, pointing to a long, dry shift in Australia's environment over tens of thousands of years that could have starved these giant animals out of existence gradually, with human arrival being little more than a coincidence in timing. The other camp argued for what researchers call imperceptible overkill, not organised mass hunts, but scattered. Low-level hunting by early Aboriginal populations that, over centuries, was enough to tip slow-breeding giant species into extinction. Species too large and too slow to recover from even modest hunting pressure. For decades, neither side had the dating precision to settle it, and one anomalous New South Wales site, Cuddy Springs, seemed to muddy the picture further by appearing to show megafauna and human tools sharing the same sediment layer for an extended period. The debate finally started to move when researchers found a more precise way to read the past fossilised spores of a fungus called Sporormiella, which grows specifically on the dung of large plant-eating animals and survives in sediment cores for tens of thousands of years as a kind of biological population tracker. When researchers pulled a core spanning 150,000 years from sediment off the coast of southwest Australia, the Sporormiella record showed something decisive. Megafauna numbers stayed high and stable for over 100,000 years through real, documented climate swings, and only collapsed sharply between roughly 45,000 and 43,000 years ago, a window landing within a few thousand years of the first confirmed human arrival on the continent. The climate data simply didn't move at the same time the animals disappeared. The humans did. Here is what that means. Stripped of the academic language. Australia's giant animals did not vanish because the land turned against them. They vanished within a narrow window after people arrived, at a pace far too fast to be explained by drought or vegetation change alone, and far too quiet to have left behind obvious kill sites or mass graves. Researchers now believe the mechanism was almost invisible in real time. Something as small as one hunted animal per person per decade, repeated across a landscape and across centuries, is enough to erase a slow-breeding giant species without leaving a single dramatic archaeological trace. No blitzkrieg. No sudden slaughter. Just a quiet, cumulative pressure that a fast-breeding species could absorb, and a marsupial lion or a 2-metre kangaroo could not. That is a far more unsettling explanation than any climate catastrophe, because it means extinction on this scale doesn't require a villain or a single catastrophic event. It only requires time, low pressure, and biology working exactly the way biology works. And it means the deep human history of this continent and the fossil record buried inside Naracoorte's chambers were never two separate stories. They were unfolding in the same landscape, quite possibly at the same time, long before either one had a name. The caves didn't just preserve a graveyard of Ice Age giants. They preserved the closing chapter of a story that Aboriginal Australians were already living through, tens of thousands of years before a torch beam ever found the gap that led back down to it. Every skull pulled from that sediment is, in a very real sense, evidence from the same continent-wide event. Not a single dramatic catastrophe, but a slow, almost silent turning point in which one group of animals disappeared, while another endured, adapted, and carried the memory of that landscape forward across tens of thousands of years, long enough to eventually watch scientists rediscover what their own ancestors had already known was down there. Maybe that's what makes Naracoorte more than just a tourist cave in rural South Australia. It's a 500,000-year archive that connects a fossil deposit, a still unfolding scientific debate, and one of the oldest continuous cultures on Earth, all inside the same small stretch of limestone. Only a fraction of it has ever been excavated, which means the next great discovery down there may still be waiting in the dark. What do you think actually finished off Australia's megafauna climate, humans or a mix of both? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want to keep uncovering the hidden side of this continent with us, Subscribe to Hidden Origins, there's a lot more still buried out there.